Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tom Mao. I'm Strategic Tax Director here at Stanbaugh Ness, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Continuing our Town Hall series of doing business in a disruptive era, we are very pleased today to have with us Anirban Basu, an actually recognized economist and speaker, to join us today. So before I formally introduce Anirban, just a couple of housekeeping items for you here today. We'll be with you for approximately 1 hour today. There will be a survey at the end when you log off. We really ask all of you, if you would, please complete that survey and give us your feedback on today's presentation. If you do have any questions as we progress, please feel free to drop them in the questions box on your GoToWebinar screen. We won't be monitoring the chat box, but we will be monitoring the questions. And if we have time at the end, we will present those to Anirban for answer. But if we don't, we will certainly reach out to you with answers and all those after the fact. And if you think of anything when you're filling out your survey, include that in there as well. We won't be having any polling questions today, as we are not offering CPE for this session. So in the interest of time, we'll keep moving along with that. So again, trying to keep our sessions looking to the future and being anticipatory. We hope all of you joined us last month when we had the futurist, Daniel Burris, join us. We're going to be doing the same today with Anirban. Anirban Basu, as I said, is a nationally recognized economist and speaker. He is the chairman and CEO of the Sage Policy Group, headquartered in Baltimore, with an office also in Orlando, Florida. Sage provides strategical and analytical services to multiple industries. And in addition to that, Anirban has had many other very prestigious and impressive appointments and positions, including in 2014, he was appointed by Maryland Governor Larry Hogan as the chair of Maryland's Economic Commission, a position he served in from 2014 to 2021. And just a smattering of some of the other positions that he has held include chairman of the Baltimore County Economic Advisory Committee, chief economist for the Associated Builders and Contractors, as well as the Maryland Bankers Association, and chief economic advisor for the Construction Financial Management Association, Visit Baltimore, Maryland Realtors, and Markham Inc. He also is a instructor at Johns Hopkins University, lecturing on global strategy, as well as a number of other subjects, and has a weekday radio show on WYPR in Baltimore. And I could go on, but I think you can get the feel for how honored we are to have Anirban with us here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to him. So thank you very much.
Righto. Good afternoon to everyone. I presume it's afternoon where you are. My name is Anirban Basu. Thank you, Tom, for that very kind introduction. We are here to talk about the economy today, particularly as it relates to real estate, construction, architectural services, and engineering services. It's a privilege to be with you today. My presentation is entitled No Time to Buy. This is a James Bond themed presentation. You'll see that theming throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope I don't hate it. It is firmly baked within the cake. And as had been noted by Tom, please use that question box. I will leave some time at the end to try to address your questions, and look forward to that part of this as well. And as had been said, we have roughly an hour, maybe a bit less than that, to go. So now, many places where I could begin a discourse regarding the economy, of course. I could talk about Russia and Ukraine and the impact on global supply chain, energy prices, so on and so forth. I could talk about ongoing economic lockdowns in China and the implications of that for inflation and global supply chains, all of that. But as it turns out, these two phenomena, along with many others, all have helped to produce the thing that we've been talking about most in America in recent months, the most salient characteristic of the U.S. economy in recent months, in fact, for the last year and a half roughly, and that, of course, is the specter of inflation. Let's talk about how we got here and what this portends for real estate, construction, architectural, and engineering services. So I must tell you that this bout of inflation has come as a surprise to many folks. Didn't see this coming. It's been 4 decades since we've been dealing with something like this, excess inflation to this degree. Economists are not alone. Many business people and others have also been surprised. Now, somewhere in America, there's a millennial who might have said pre-pandemic, hey, look, why do we even measure inflation? It's always 2%. Why do we even bother to measure it, they might say. and then listen to some awful music that they listen to. Anyway, the point is, those of us who were cognizant through the 1970s into the early 1980s know that inflation need not be 2%. Has certainly not been 2% recently. This is your consumer price index. I could show you many measures of inflation, but they all basically show that inflation is running at a 4-decade high. Much of the data I will show you this afternoon, parenthetically, are time series data. So the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. There are two lines here. The line that ends at the top, that darker blue colored line, that's your all items consumer price index. That indicates that inflation over the past 12 months has been running at 8.2% on a year-over-year basis. That certainly is not 2%. Now, the lighter blue colored line is arguably more important. That's the so-called core inflation rate, all items minus or less food and energy. We economists occasionally like to exclude such prices, food and energy prices, from such computations because food and energy prices are notoriously volatile, but also susceptible to non-economic influence like Vladimir Putin, as it turns out, but also natural disaster and weather. So to get a pure measure of economic inflation, we often look at this core measure, and that's running at 6.6% over the past year. But what's most important about this, perhaps, is that over the last couple of months, if you look at that lighter blue colored line, that less food and energy line, inflation has actually been rising recently. And so while many people talk about peak inflation, perhaps overall inflation has peaked as natural gas prices and some other prices fall, the fact of the matter is that core inflation is still strong. And I'll talk in a moment about why inflation actually might be broadening in America to touch upon more segments of the economy. So the headline inflation number, that 8.2%, that's off its peak. But the core inflation rate, I would suggest to you, will stay stubbornly high for many months to come, even as the Federal Reserve tries to rid the economy of excess inflation. Now, let's talk about that Federal Reserve, shall we? Because they've been among the group of people who've been surprised by this enduring bout of inflation. They're the ones who, of course, influence economic and therefore inflationary outcomes by shaping monetary policy. This bout of inflation begins in roughly the spring of 2021, the spring of last year. And by the summer of last year, say June of 2021, inflation in our country is running at around 6% year over year. So these are some of the statements coming out of Federal Open Market Committee meetings around that time. As inflation is becoming more of an issue in America, these are some of the statements coming out of those meetings at which they set interest rate policy, the policy with respect to the optimal level for the federal funds rate or the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And of course, their next meeting is November 1st and November 2nd. So in June of 2020, if you look at the northwest corner of the slide, in June of 2021, the statement was, quote, inflation has risen, largely reflecting transitory factors. Now, a synonym for the word transitory is fleeting. So the notion here is very simple. This is temporary, very temporary. Don't you worry about it, America. We know that this inflation has emerged in our country, but it's very temporary and it's going to go away on its own. This is a function of reopening the economy from the pandemic, some lingering supply chain disruptions, which undoubtedly will go away very, very quickly. So please, America, don't worry about it. You've got other things to worry about. Inflation is not one of them. By July, the statement is inflation has risen. Inflation has risen, largely reflecting transitory factors. Another month has passed, but nothing has changed in the narrative. By September, the statement is inflation is elevated, largely reflecting transitory factors. So your central bank took the time to change the word risen to elevated because it rose during the spring, stays elevated into the fall of 2021. But the key word here, of course, is still transitory. It's temporary. Now, there's stretching the meaning of the word transitory by this point. It's been half a year of inflation, but that's sort of the notion. It's still temporary. Don't worry about it. We don't have to do anything about it. It's going to go away on its own, by itself. By November, the statement is inflation is elevated, largely reflecting factors that are expected to be transitory. So now they're starting to admit, hey, we might have a problem here. Inflation may not be ingrained into the economy because it's now ingrained into people's expectations. If you're a restaurant owner and you see 6 or 8% inflation, you're going to factor that into next year's menu prices. If you're a labor union negotiator, same thing. You're going to try to factor that into your negotiations for the next 3 or 4 year wage contract. So expectations become, to a certain extent, at least, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by December, the Federal Reserve has thrown in the towel. The statement is completely transfigured. Quote, supply and demand imbalances related to the pandemic and the reopening of the economy have continued to contribute to elevated levels of inflation. They've given up on the word transitory. That word is dead, gone, and buried. But not only have they pivoted by this point in terms of their language, they've also pivoted in terms of their policymaking. Now the notion is they're going to have to raise interest rates. They're going to have to tighten monetary policy. Now, at that time in December of 2021, there was a conventional wisdom suggesting that they might have to raise rates maybe 3 times in 2022 in terms of quarter point equivalents. The first economist of note who I heard suggested might be 4 times around that time, December of 2021, is a guy named Jan Hatzius. Jan Hatzius is the chief economist of Goldman Sachs. And in December of 2021, he says, I think it might be 4 times. Now, Jan Hatzius works for Goldman Sachs, so his house is bigger than mine, but he does not drive a Mustang. In any case, the conventional wisdom now is the Federal Reserve will raise rates in terms of quarter point equivalents 17 or 18 times this year. 12 increases have already occurred, meaning 3 percentage points on the Fed funds rate. So that's 12 quarter point equivalents. 3 more to come November 2nd, 0.75% rate increase. And then the big debate will be whether they will go 0.75% in terms of rate increases in December or 0.5%. If you watch CNBC or Bloomberg, some pundits will come on and say, if it's 0.5%, that's the end of the world. And if some others will say, if it's 0.75%, that's the end of the world. Apparently, the world is ending, but we're going to get further rate increases balance of the year. And that has got to change the economic outlook for construction and real estate, two heavily leveraged segments of the economy. And of course, whatever affects that would tend to impact architects and at least certain groups of engineers. Now, we get a separate statement coming out of that December 2021 Federal Reserve Bank meeting from our Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, who says, quote, these problems have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, meaning we were surprised. We told you, the American people, for the better part of the year, it was merely transitory. We were wrong. It is not transitory. Exacerbated by waves of the virus, not our fault. This is Delta, this is Omicron. We're not genetic epidemiologists or virologists. We're simply monetary policymakers, and we missed it. As a result, overall inflation is running well above our 2% longer run goal and will likely continue to do so well into next year. Well, they got that right. It is above 2%. And now they're racing to undo what they have done. And again, this should not have surprised them to this extent. Why? Because they actually exert some influence over inflationary outcomes, including by shaping the size of the nation's money supply. Here, graph back to 1959. And you can see how profound the growth in money supply has been over the course of the pandemic era. You can also see, if you look toward the far right of the slide, that they have tried to break the economy. B-R-A-K-E, but also B-R-E-A-K, as it turns out, both are appropriate. Right? But slammed down, money supply growth. Again, it's trying to undo what they have done, which is to help unleash this burst of inflation. Now, in monetary theory, there is a basic equation known as the quantity equation, also known as the equation of exchange. I like to call it the equation of exchange because that's just downright sexier. And that equation says that when you increase money supply, 2 things can happen. Either economic growth accelerates, meaning output growth, measured, for instance, in terms of real gross domestic product. And that, of course, is the goal, to stimulate economic growth to countervail the worst effects of the pandemic on the economy. And or 2, price growth, meaning inflation accelerates. But here's the thing. As they were ramping up money supply at an unprecedented rate, what do we know is happening in the economy? Not enough workers, not enough truck drivers, supply chain disruptions, serial lockdowns in economies around the world. And so as they were increasing money supply, output growth was constrained because of all these supply side issues. So what took on much of the burden of equilibrating that equation? Prices. So the same people who've been telling you it's merely transitory are the same people who basically guaranteed it would not be. And on top of that, of course, the federal government also is stimulating the economy. So all of this produces this bout of enduring inflation. So, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting to anyone on this call, but the only reason we've had this bout of enduring inflation is because of money supply or monetary policy generally. There have been some other issues. Unfortunately, they've also tended to push inflation higher. For instance, we have had these supply chain disruptions. This comes from the US Census Bureau's Small Business Pulse Survey. And the question on the table is, in the last week, did this business have any of the following? So the red line there is about domestic supplier delays. So during the last week in April, and these data only go through April because the Census Bureau is retooling this survey. In the last week of April, 45% of small business said, yes, I suffered some form of domestic supplier delay. But notice the issue here. It didn't change for months. It didn't get better. And this has been surprising to me because we've been operating in this just-in-time inventory world. If you wanted it, it would be there for you just in time. But that supply chain smoothness, predictability, no longer exists for whatever reason. Partially because supply chains are on the move. They're peripatetic, including a lot of reshoring back to the United States. Some of that might be because of China's economic lockdowns. China is home to a quarter of global manufacturing. Europe, of course, is facing an energy crisis, with some manufacturers expecting to shut down at least partially this winter. The blue line, in fact, relates to foreign supplier delays. Same story. And if the supply side of the economy can't work efficiently or predictably, that breeds scarcity, and people competing over scarce items will tend to drive prices higher, all things being equal. In fact, the sheer nature of the economic recovery to date has been a source of inflation. This is quarterly GDP growth back to 1990, so annualized rates of growth, but quarterly data. Some unfortunate sophistication or complexity on this slide, two vertical axes instead of one. The blue color bars are indexed to the left-hand vertical axis, the red color bars to the right, and you will note that the numbers on the right-hand vertical axis are much larger in magnitude to accommodate the volatility of the economy over the course of the pandemic. Now, reading from left to right, the last blue colored bar here is the fourth quarter of 2019. It is a quarter of economic growth. We enter 2020 with momentum. This nation added jobs in January of 2020. That's 376,000 jobs in February of 2020, a perfectly respectable tally. Has a 50-year low in unemployment, 3.5%, which is, by the way, where unemployment is today. Shuts down its economy in March of 2020. Now, March of 2020, of course, is embodied by the first quarter of 2020, here designated by the first red color bar reading from left to right. And during that quarter, the U.S. economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's big news by itself. That's a headline. For instance, during the fourth quarter of 2008, which had been the worst quarter of our economic lives, the U.S. economy shrinks 8.4% on an annualized basis. So negative 5% print is a big deal. Unfortunately, this time around, it was merely the appetizer. For during the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy shrinks 31.4% on an annualized basis. That's that red bar that you see slumping to the south of the slide. And around that time, a vicious debate breaks out in the economics community regarding what the initial phase of recovery might look like. Would it be U-shaped, L-shaped, Nike swoosh, check mark, square root, hockey stick? Is it straight up V? For during the third quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy bounces back, growing 33.4% on an annualized basis, the red bar that you see climbing to the north of the slide. At no point has the supply side of the economy been able to handle that rate of growth, that level of demand expansion. You'll notice that during several ensuing quarters, high single-digit growth rates for an economy accustomed to growing 1.5% to 3% per annum. The supply side has not been able to handle that. Scarcity, higher prices. Granted, during the first 2 quarters of 2022, U.S. GDP turns negative in real terms. In inflation-adjusted terms, we suffer a technical recession. But for the most part, recovery has been V-shaped, very vigorous, and that is largely been inflationary. So now we're talking about a number of factors. We've talked about money supply and monetary policy. We've talked about supply chain disruptions, of course. We've talked about the sheer nature of the recovery to date as explanations for this bout of inflation. But to more completely explain why inflation endures and will continue to do so well into next year, and maybe through next year, we need to talk about at least one other factor. And that factor pertains to the behavior or dynamics of the U.S. labor market. Let's turn to that now. Now, one of the things that we get from the federal government each and every month are data from the JOLTS survey, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. And that survey indicates that as of August, America home to 10.1 million available unfilled jobs. Now, you might look at the slide and say, well, the number of job openings is falling, Anirban. That's true. But compare the number of job openings now to what it was, let's say, pre-pandemic, when the economy was very strong, it was growing, lengthiest economic expansion in American history, 50-year low in unemployment. We had about 7 million available jobs. Today, we have about 1 3/4 job openings for every unemployed American. If you round up, it's 2 job openings for every unemployed American. America is still very much the land of opportunity, despite what some people might have you believe. If you want a job in America, there's one waiting for you. Oh, I'm sorry, there are 2. And one of the reasons that there are these elevated numbers of job openings is because the size of the labor force is meaningfully smaller than it would have been but for the pandemic. And that's true for a number of reasons. Now, I can make that statement in many different ways, but let me use the labor force participation rate here graphed back to 1950. This is the proportion of working age Americans who are either working or looking for work. They are engaged. As an aside note, the rapid growth in labor force participation in this country during the late 1960s through the 70s and 1980s. This is as women join the labor market en masse. America broadly shifts from single income households to dual income households. Some of you might remember the very popular television show from the late 1980s, 30 something, first broadcast in 1987. It was about those dual income households or members thereof operating in the Philadelphia suburbs. So because they were spending so much time on their careers, they did not have enough time for each other, did not have enough time to pick up dry cleaning. It was not the very deepest of shows, as it turns out, but featured an extraordinarily attractive cast along with actor Timothy Busfield. Now, this pattern of rising labor force participation ends roughly with the turn of the millennium. Now, as we approach the pandemic, the economy is very strong. And so labor force participation is tilting higher as employers are really looking for workers and offering higher pay. A pandemic eve labor force participation rate is 63.4% in this country. It then collapses to 60.2% as 8 million people leave the labor force for various reasons, including fear of infection. It has since bounced back to 62.3%, but nowhere near where it was pre-pandemic. And one of the industries most negatively impacted by that is construction. Why? Because many of our finest construction workers, our skilled craftspeople, are baby boomers. And 1.6 million baby boomers retired earlier than anticipated during the early stages of the pandemic for various reasons. And often those have been our finest construction workers. They've been refining their skills for decades. They learned their love of working with their hands and minds and equipment early in life, often in high school shop class. Shop class typically taught by someone with enormous arms, wearing a Rush t-shirt and driving a Trans Am. That kind of person has been weeded out of the curriculum. Fewer people, young people, are exposed to the skilled construction trades as pathways to prosperity. And so when you've got a lot of retirement, some of it premature, and not much entry, you're going to have issues in the skilled trades. And so we continue to have this structural shortage of skilled construction workers. That's inflationary. But here's another thing. What people want out of the world of work has also changed over the course of the pandemic. Good Hire is a background check company out of Redwood City, California. They recently conducted a survey of 3,500 Americans. If you look for the northwest corner of the slide, 68% of Americans would choose remote work options over in-office or at the job site work. They do not want to go to a workplace. They do not want to go to a job site. Cat, computer, coffee, that is not for them. That's not for a fulfilling life. They don't want to commute. They don't want to be with their colleagues. They do not like their colleagues. A separate survey concludes that 57% of Americans find their colleagues to be annoying. They overshare, meaning I don't really care what you did over the weekend. They take credit for one another's work. Hey, I did that. And third, of course, they interrupt, which can happen, meaning during meetings, for instance. They interrupt, which can happen during a Zoom meeting, of course, and typically does. Nonetheless, there is this preference, overwhelming preference for remote work options. If you look at the third bullet on the left-hand side, 74% of Americans believe that companies not offering remote working arrangements will lose major talent in the workforce. Of course, 100% of people answering that question view themselves as major talent. But the point is there's this expectation and this desire to work remotely. And so for industries like construction, manufacturing, and there's some manufacturers, of course, on the call, for people in hotel operations, restaurants, brick and mortar retail, the service has to be delivered at the job site, generally speaking. And so as a result, this creates even greater shortage. So how do employers deal with this scarcity? Well, of course, they pay more. This is your employment cost index. Now, this is 12-month percentage change. So if you look at the top blue line there, the line that ends at the top, that's wage increase. You can see how profound that's been over the course of the pandemic. Wages are growing faster, that's inflationary, of course. If you look at the light blue colored line at the bottom, that's your benefit cost increase in percentage terms. You can see a lot of inflation there recently. And why is that? Well, more and more employers are trying to put more into their benefit packages to better tailor their packages to what employees actually want in the environment of the Great Resignation. We've had about 4 to 4.2 million people quitting their jobs each and every month this year, right? So how do you retain your workers? Well, part of it is compensation, but a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on retirement benefits and healthcare benefits, that kind of thing. And like many things, by the way, this statistic is misleading, the one encompassed by the lighter blue colored line. Why? Because there are certain benefits that we employers can offer employees that would not be reflected on this chart. I'll give you an example. My firm's name is Sage Policy Group Incorporated. We're an economic consultancy in Baltimore, Maryland, again, as noted by that kind introduction. And we'll hear from Tom again, by the way, at the end as he asks me questions, so your questions. But, all of our folks are working remotely right now. I lease 2,400 square feet of office space in downtown Baltimore, parenthetically. And most of my employees are millennial economists and analysts. They are 30-somethings. Now, late last year, I asked my staff to come back to the office. And I said, look, let's collaborate, let's innovate together, let's figure out how these presentations and our reports can be improved for our clients, and plus I'm paying rent. So I need to justify that. So let's go back into the office. And now these are millennials, so they said to me, boss, because I don't think they know my name, so they call me boss, which is a fine thing to be called, by the way. But boss, thank you so much for thinking of us. It's not going to happen. Now, they're millennials, so they didn't communicate quite so directly. They simply didn't show up. But the point is that I'm offering our staff the opportunity to work remotely, but that would not be shown on a chart like this. There's no transaction there. There's no monetization there. And then the red line there is overall compensation. And you can see it's all inflationary and tilted aggressively higher, by the way. So that, of course, is inflation. And when you've got 10.1 million available jobs, 1 3/4 job openings for every unemployed American, that inflation is not going to go away anytime soon. And by the way, many of these workers, let's say they've received a 5 or 6% wage increase, which normally would be very good, but they might turn around to their employer and say, look, 5% wage increase, I mean, that's okay, I guess, but inflation is 8.2%. I'm falling behind. You need to pay me even more. That's inflationary. Nonetheless, despite higher compensation costs, employers continue to hire pretty aggressively. This is monthly job change or growth in this case since May of 2020, when the recovery from the early stages of the pandemic began. If you look at the last bar here, that's for September. In September, America adds 263,000 jobs, a perfectly respectable total and above consensus expectations. So employers have dealt with this inflation by spending right through it and hiring. Consumers have dealt with this inflation by spending right through it and spending. We'll talk more about that later. That's where we are right now. That's the nature of our overheated economy, where even in the face of inflation, people keep spending, they keep hiring, so on and so forth. And so the Federal Reserve looks at this and says, we need to cool this economy down. And again, we want to talk about what this means for construction and real estate. Now, because we've been adding jobs so consistently, we now support more jobs economy-wide than we did pre-pandemic. This is national data. This is non-farm employment, February 2020 compared to September of 2022. Why those goalposts? February of 2020 is the last month before we shut down the economy. September of 2022 is the last month before we have data. So if you look at that, we now have 514,000 more jobs supported by this economy, non-farm jobs. The farm employment data are treated separately by the federal government. But 514,000 more non-farm jobs than we did pre-pandemic. We're back. Now, gross domestic product has recovered even faster. By the second quarter of last year, gross domestic product national output was above its pre-pandemic level. So employment has taken a lot more time to recover, but that's because it's been so difficult to find workers to fill available jobs. Now, these other horizontal bars represent the number of jobs added or subtracted by each of these sectors over the course of this pandemic era. So if you look at professional business services, undoubtedly we have some accountants here. Makes sense given the nature of who is sponsoring this, who has made this all possible, and thank you to them for making this possible. But professional business services, that includes your accountancies, your attorneys, for the most part, will be classified there. A lot of white-collar employees. So why is that segment adding so many jobs? Well, it's a pretty large part of the economy, but also, disproportionately, these firms offer the opportunity for people to work remotely. And because many job seekers are looking for that kind of opportunity, then categorized in these segments. And then below that, trade, transportation, and utilities. That's your supply chain, that's your truck driver, that's your fulfillment center worker, that's Amazon and Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos had a good year last year, not romantically, but in terms of hiring a couple 100,000 associates last year on top of about 500,000 in 2020. Construction, a segment of great interest today, up 95,000 jobs, but in 2.5+ years, For a segment of the economy that's big, that's almost nothing. And yet many contractors tell me they have much greater difficulty finding workers now than they did pre-pandemic, and it was not so easy pre-pandemic, as you will remember. Let me show you some regional data. People here on this call come from various parts of the country, and maybe other countries, I'm not sure, but certainly various parts of the United States of America. This is employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in this country. February 2020 versus September of 2022. The September of 2022 data have just arrived. So it is a partially mistitled slide. There are some regions of the country that have not yet generated employment growth over this period, but many have. And at number one, Dallas, Texas. Now, Dallas has been booming for years, as many people know. During the most recent year for which we have census data, no region of the country added more people than Dallas. The governor of Texas, a guy named Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott, one of his guys, very aggressive in keeping the state's economy as open as possible even during the worst of the pandemic. At number four, Tampa. That's Governor Ron, I'm cherry picking now. At number four, Tampa, that's Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Again, one of these guys very interested in keeping the economy open, hewing as close to normalcy as possible, trying to retain as much economic momentum as possible. I don't know if you've ever met Governor Ron DeSantis. Probably best if you're not wearing a mask. He does not apparently like it. His worst day of the year, as it turns out, is coming up, Halloween. And then at number five is Atlanta. That's Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia, presently running for re-election, an election that's garnered much attention across the country, of course. He was the first governor of the country to reopen his economy. And at number six, Phoenix, Arizona. That's Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona. Again, one of these guys very aggressive in keeping the state's economy as open as possible, especially with respect to neighbors like California and New Mexico. So some governors are focused on that, keeping the economy as open as possible. Other governors much more focused on the public health implications of COVID-19. At number 25, San Francisco Metro, losing 1.8% of its previous base of employment. You see at number 23, tied to number 23, losing 1.3% of the employment, Los Angeles, and tied with that is New York. Now, who's the governor of California? Why, it's the wickedly handsome Gavin Newsom, himself to be a Hollywood actor, another potential presidential candidate in 2024. He was the last governor of the country to reopen his economy. And of course, New York Metro was impacted by economic lockdowns called for by then Governor Andrew Cuomo. Now, you might ask me the question, Anirban, why do you bring this up? Why does this matter? It's now latest 2022. A lot of big decisions were made back in 2020 or early 2021. Here's my explanation for this, why this matters in the data, why it has helped shape the data along with other factors. And to use my, to express my perspective on this, I will turn to the parable of Humpty Dumpty. Now, according to contemporary lore, Humpty Dumpty was an egg, but an egg with special characteristics, arms, legs, a face. One day, Humpty Dumpty is sitting on a wall, minding his own business, public property, by the way, no trespass. And somebody comes up behind Humpty Dumpty, probably Vladimir Putin, and pushes him off that wall. Now, he's an egg. He breaks all over the place. That's what eggs do when they fall like that. Now, all the king's horses and all the king's men come rushing to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I'm not sure why the horses were there. They've got no hands. They could only make matters much, much worse if you think about it. But even the men could not do it. And my point is the economy is akin to an egg. It was broken. It was fractured. But less broken in communities like Dallas, Tampa, Atlanta, Phoenix than in Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And it's been hard to reconstitute that egg, meaning the economy, given supply chain disruptions and, of course, these labor market dynamics. Now, this next slide is more important. Same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of employment growth in percentage terms, these are now unemployment rates. And here is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. This is only through August. But here's the problem. These unemployment rates are too low. And you say, that's crazy talk. We love low rates of unemployment. Well, yes, we do. We love it when job seekers can quickly find jobs and so on and so forth, and people feel a sense of job security. We love that, except when you got 10.1 million available unfilled jobs and inflation is raging. Because the Federal Reserve looks at these data and says, oh my goodness, 2.1% unemployment in Minneapolis, that's too low. You cannot grow that economy in a non-inflationary way when workers are so scarce. Same thing in Tampa, 2.7%, or Atlanta, so on and so forth. But even in the regions with the highest rates of unemployment, less than 5%. And so the Federal Reserve says, we're going to break this equilibrium. We're going to have to damage the labor market to get back to 2% inflation. We can't have people getting 5 or 6% raises a year. You can't get to 2% inflation that way. You're going to have to break this labor market. Now, the official word, of course, is we're going to engineer a soft landing. We're going to slow economic growth by raising interest rates, but not drive us into recession. We shall see, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But that's sort of one of the things that's hanging over the economy. And so we're in this period during which good news is bad news. Because if we get a good jobs report, let's say on Friday, or on a Friday, 2 Fridays from now, if we get a good jobs report, oh, great, it's a great jobs report. But many people say, oh, that's terrible. That's terrible because it means the Federal Reserve has to work that much harder to soften the economy. That means further interest rate increases, including perhaps early next year. Now, enough of that. Let's talk about, I think, the data in which you might have most interest today, the construction data. I'll talk about first residential construction, and then I'll talk about commercial or non-residential construction. And again, please use that question box if you've got any questions. This is my penultimate section of the presentation, and then I'll give you my forecast, and then we're done. So, as I say, we'll start residentially, and we've been talking a lot about the Federal Reserve. In fact, we began the discussion by talking about the Federal Reserve. Good place to start, by the way. Because their activities are shaping not just our economy, but the global economy. And again, they largely influence the economy by shaping, perhaps misshaping, interest rates. Here I'm showing you 2 interest rates of interest, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue and the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in red. And you can see that during much of the pandemic period, toward the right of the slide, mortgage rates at record lows. You can also see the revenge of mortgage rates. So in January, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate was 3.22%. You can see that it's now screaming towards 7%. And the home building market broadly is described as being in recession now. It's retrenching, given these elevated mortgage rates. Right? Housing affordability has fallen even further. Now, I will tell you this. I'm an economist. I'm going to provide you with a forecast later on in the presentation. By the way, it doesn't matter if you believe my forecast or not. That's not what's relevant. What I'm trying to do for you, those of you on this call, is to try to issue spot for you so that you can refine your own forecast of the economy and determine what that means for your enterprise. But I'm an economist. I'm in the business of forecasting, therefore. I do not like to be surprised. I do not like admitting being surprised. But I have been surprised, not by the fact that home prices rose during the public health emergency, mind you. I thought that would happen. Low mortgage rates, people wanted to social distance more aggressively, more space for home offices and home gyms. But I have been surprised, or had been surprised, by the pace at which home prices appreciated during a public health crisis. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. And you can see how profound the growth in home prices has been for much of the pandemic period. You can also see that prices are no longer rising. What does that look like, by the way? Money supply. That looks just like money supply. Mortgage rates were low, prices take off. Mortgage rates rise, prices don't. Now, many people will look at this and say, oh, goodness, look at that. That looks like a straight up bubble. That looks like 03, 04, 05 all over again. And for the most part, those folks are dead wrong. Remember 03, 04, and 05? You remember one of the most salient aspects of economic life back then? Flawed lending. That was your no document loan, your subprime mortgage. So we had too much lending taking place. At least that's my suggestion to you. You may agree or disagree. We had artificially elevated demand for housing, and therefore builders, seeing that demand for housing, tried to supply to that demand. Because in some cases, or many instances, the home builder doesn't actually care if the person buying the home pays their mortgage or not. Once they leave the settlement table, they're done with the deal. And in that era of flawed lending, we had a lot of people who were unable to ultimately pay their mortgages. In fact, look back at historical data and see how many Americans missed their first mortgage payment. So got the mortgage, bought the home, got the coupon booklet that we used to use to pay the mortgage, never once used the coupon booklet. That's not sustainable. But as far as I can tell, this cycle, lending standards have been far more disciplined. And if there is a disequilibrium in the housing market, it's not that we have too many homes for sale, it's that we have far too few. This is vacant housing units for sale. So the home has been built, it's waiting to be sold, or the homeowner has vacated the home, they're living someplace else now, the home is for sale. Look how much we had available for sale back in 06, 07, 08, as the lending markets are shutting down because so many Americans have found their way into mortgage delinquency. The problem now, as you know, is we don't have enough homes for sale, particularly for young families. Now, one of the things I want to do for you as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I've got about 11 more minutes left, is I want to show you a number of leading economic indicators. Because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been going on to a discussion of what's likely to happen during the year plus ahead. So here's a leading indicator. It's U.S. residential building permits. That's a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit. Now, the segment I'll focus on first is the red segment. That relates to single unit structures. That's your townhomes and single family homes. Look how much we're building back in 03, 04, 05. As again, demand for housing or home ownership opportunities was artificially elevated by flawed lending. That house of cards had to collapse. You can see that it does. Great recession, global financial crisis, lingering foreclosure crisis. And for many years thereafter, it's tough to get a mortgage, and we don't build many single-family units. Meanwhile, something is happening on top of the surface, not under the surface, on top of it. Demographics. The millennials are coming of age. Ask yourself, what is the most common age in America this year? 30 years old. We have more 30-year-olds than any other age. What's the second most common age in America this year? 31. What's the third most common age in America this year? 29. 5 years ago, the most common age in America was 25. What do 25-year-olds do? Mostly weed. But they might rent an apartment, which lines up neatly with the apartment building boom that we saw during the previous decade. Now they're household formation age. We have an incredible number of weddings taking place in America this year. Now, part of that is catch up from the pandemic. Part of that is just sheer demographics. And many of these young people are together, but they don't want to get married because they're not into that. But they're together. They don't necessarily have kids, but they treat their pets like kids. And they want a new domicile. They want a new lifestyle. They want to own a home. They can't find one. Even during the pandemic period, when demand for housing was really elevated, supercharged by a number of factors, we couldn't build as many homes as we would have liked because softwood lumber prices and other input costs took off and there weren't enough workers. So unable to find new homes, what do these young families do? They end up renting for lengthier periods. The blue segment here is multifamily unit structures, 2+ unit structures, mostly apartments, could be condominiums, but it's mostly apartments. That's where I see the strength lingering in the residential construction marketplace, multifamily, because people need a place to live, and all things being equal, higher mortgage rates are actually good for the multifamily market. I think you will ultimately see some weakness there for reasons we're going to get into, but it'll still be one of the more stable segments of construction, privately financed construction, during the months ahead. Now, this leading indicator again relates to residential activity. This one relates more to commercial activity. They're also multifamily. This is your architecture billings index. So you see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading above 50 means that architects are collectively busier this month than they were last month. Well, in September, the reading was 51.7. So in September, architects were collectively busier than they were in August. August, July, June, May. I think you know the months. The point is pretty busy. Many architects tell me after presentations, I'm as busy now or busier than I was pre-pandemic. I'm designing a ton of projects. And as a leading indicator, why is it a leading indicator? It's a leading indicator because if architects are busy upstream, contractors are more likely to be busy downstream, at least contractors who work on projects or that work on projects involving architects, like apartment buildings, offices, hotels, shopping centers, so on and so forth. But I think that's a leading economic indicator, and I'm glad that the architects on this call are generally very busy. I'm glad that there's demand for your services, but ask the question, why are you so busy? And I think in my mind, one of the reasons for this is that there's so much capital to deploy, right? If you're a private equity firm, you can't just be sitting in 10-year treasuries yielding 4.15% or 2-year treasuries yielding 4.4%. I mean, your investors are looking for more creativity than that and also more yield. But one of the places to deploy capital, of course, is real estate. And when money is invested in real estate, that often translates into construction as properties are repositioned in the marketplace. And that can often involve an architect, of course, or built from scratch, which almost always involves an architect or two or more. But, yes, lots of projects are being designed, but I think this is a flawed leading indicator these days because a lot of these projects that are designed may not ultimately reach the construction phase. Here's why. So the market has to accommodate construction. But, some of these projects might be beautifully designed, might even have a nice location, but they might be in the wrong segment. I'll give you an example. This is your US office vacancy rate. And of course, so many people are working remotely, and we have a lot of leases being renewed each and every year that will not be renewed. People don't need as much space anymore. More people are working remotely and they like it. So I think office vacancy remains stubbornly high, and that frustrates, of course, office space construction or new office construction. Here's, one of the other things that happened during the early stages of the pandemic, we had this shakeup in retail activity. We couldn't go out, right? We couldn't go to the mall. So a lot of business went online. I mean, online had been growing for years, but it really takes off during the early stages of the pandemic. So in 2020, we suffered a wave of retail bankruptcies, the likes of Pure and Imports, True Religion, GNC, Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J. Crew, Brooks Brothers, Lord & Taylor, Francesca's, Guitar Center, many others. And with retail bankruptcies come attendant store closures often. Even some retailers that did not go bankrupt, like a Macy's, closed lots of stores. And so this is your this is your retail space vacancy rate for American malls. This is your mall vacancy rate. Very high. And in fact, many malls are likely to fall over the next 5 years. And they'll be repositioned in the market. That's good real estate. We often refer to malls as town centers. But in terms of shopping center construction, in many cases, we have enough shopping center space at this time. And the critical thing is trying to maintain occupancy. Now, speaking of occupancy, here is hotel occupancy in the United States. The last 3 bars here, 2019, 2020, 2021. And admittedly, 2021 was a year of partial recovery. And leisure travel has come back with a vengeance. Those of you who have been on vacation recently or been on a flight know that there are a lot of leisure travelers out there. The planes are pretty full, aren't they? But business travel has not come back with a vengeance. And you can understand why. If you're a business enterprise, you're a profit maximizer. That's what the ownership of the business gets, the profits. But to profit maximize, one must be a cost minimizer. And one way to minimize costs, of course, is to have meetings via Zoom or go to webinar or other Cisco WebEx, whatever it happens to be, Microsoft Teams. Saves on airfare, saves on hotel rooms, saves on gasoline. And so I would not expect business travel to come back with a vengeance because it's pretty economical to do things the way we're doing things right now. Not as fun, maybe, as being in a ballroom in Orlando or something like that and then going out and playing 18 rounds of golf, but nonetheless, here we are and we're discussing the economy pretty efficiently, pretty economically. Something else is happening though, I must tell you. There are other reasons that projects are not moving forward. So let's talk through this. As defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are listed here. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in construction spending for the period February 2020 versus August of 2022. So again, the pandemic period. Look at what's at the bottom here. Which segment has suffered the most? Lodging, that's your hotel room construction. A few categories above that is office. Now that's misleading because the office category also includes construction of data centers. And by the way, these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. But data center construction has been hot and heavy. And I would expect it to continue to be. It might slow down a bit from its previous highs, but it's still expected to be one of the stronger segments in construction going forward for structural reasons. But it's the traditional office space construction that's way down as it turns out. Now, you'll notice that there's some segments, publicly financed segments, where we see a fair amount of construction activity, so water supply and sewage and waste disposal. If you're in public construction, you have no issues right now. Many public construction firms I talk to, people who work on infrastructure, for instance, tell me, we're going to be busy for 5 years, Anirban, and then we don't know. But for the next 5 years, we're going to be busy. And I believe that. It's really the weakness in private construction that I observe. So for instance, if you look at the GDP data, this is non-residential fixed investment in structures. Now, this is inflation adjusted, but this is building construction. So you get all those architecture buildings. We got a fair amount of investment in manufacturing facilities, construction thereof, data centers, fulfillment centers, healthcare. But overall construction investment in structures is down. So a lot of projects apparently are not moving forward. Here's another thing. So let's say the project owner has a project designed by a brilliant architect. It's a fabulous design, great location, everything's working. I'm moving forward with this project. I don't care what the economists say. It's going to work. So now they put the project out for bid. And the bids come in from the general contractors. And then the project owner looks at the bid and says, I'm sorry, are these numbers for my project? Because this doesn't look anything like my pro forma. Now, if these numbers are for my project, my pro forma does not pencil out. And one of the exogenous shocks that hit construction, of course, has been inflation. This is inputs to construction producer price index data. And what does it say? Well, it says that over the past 12 months, which we have data, September of 2021 versus September of 2022, materials prices are up 16.3%. Now, we might have hit the peak already. We might have passed the peak. But a lot of projects may not move forward simply because of this cost increase, but also even bigger than this, of course, is the cost of capital. I was talking to a developer yesterday at the Ravens game, Baltimore won, and they were telling me, you economists focus a lot on the construction materials prices, which have risen a lot, but it's really the interest rate increases that are hitting us the most in terms of determining whether or not we can move forward with certain projects. That the impact of financial is just much bigger from that. Okay, but interest rates are moving higher. Materials prices are elevated. Here's another way of looking at things. I can break this down for you more finely. This is, again, construction materials producer price index data. So natural gas prices by this measure up 106.5% through September. True, though, natural gas prices have been falling recently. Softwood lumber up 14.5%. Concrete product prices. Typically, concrete rises about 2 to 3% a year in terms of price. 14.3%. And concrete, of course, is ubiquitous in construction, including, of course, public construction. I still think government has the money, they're going to spend it. But how much bang for the buck will the taxpayer get, given that the cost of construction is so elevated relative to historic norms? Again, because there are not enough workers and because materials prices are sky high, not to mention the role of equipment shortages. Okay, enough of that. Let's give you the forecast. I hope you've, to this point, enjoyed this James Bond theme presentation. My name is Anirban, and I want to give you some more leading indicators to get you to the forecast. Let me give you another one. So some of our leading indicators out there are psychological indicators. And a good example of this is the Consumer Confidence Index. So you ask consumers, how do you feel about the world? And according to the various surveys, the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Survey, for instance, Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index, the consumer in America, the American, is miserable. Americans are miserable. I mean, sometimes people will ask me the question, why do people drive so angry? Because they're angry. Because of national debt above $30 trillion and concerns about midterm elections and Russia and Ukraine. But the number one factor that hasn't upset, of course, inflation. Right? Food prices up 11.4% over the past year. Rent skyrocketing. That has people pretty upset. So the consumer says to the Consumer Confidence Survey, look, I'm an American and I'm upset. I'm very unhappy. National debt, inflation, all these things. But I can't talk any further about these issues with you because I'm going shopping. This is U.S. manufacturers' new orders for consumer goods. It's orders. It's a leading indicator because orders lead to production. Production leads to distribution. You don't see much indication of the consumers pulling back. They've kept spending right through it. In fact, you'll find many economists will tell you we're not headed for a recession. The Federal Reserve can engineer a soft landing. Job market is strong, and that's supporting ongoing consumer spending. And the consumer is 2/3 of aggregate demand. Can't have a recession if the consumer is still spending, and they are. They pulled a bit back on new car purchases because interest rates are high and that affects new car purchases. But by and large, the consumer is still at it. And you can see that in the malls and elsewhere. Here's another thing. The economy, broadly speaking, is demand and supply. Well, actually, we've got some good news on the supply side of the economy. This is from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve's Manufacturing Business Outlook Survey. You see the zero line across the middle of the slide? Any reading below zero means that delivery times over the next 6 months are expected to fall. Now, all of our supply chain issues are not behind us, that's for sure, but we have actually seen in recent months some improvement in supply side action in terms of falling delivery times. And actually, shipping charges around the world are plummeting. So that should ultimately lead to more effective delivery and ultimately lower prices. So you find many economists who will tell you we're not headed for recession. Here's another thing. Look at the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators. So this is 10 leading indicators all bundled into one number. And I'm graphing through that for you, that composite index through September of 2022. Yes, recent readings have been falling. The economy is slowing. We all know that. But recent readings have been quite elevated. Again, many economists will tell you we're not headed for recession. Which brings me to my final substantive slide. If you're an economist, you only forecast twice. So I'll forecast at the beginning of the year, which is a forecast I'm sharing with you now, and then I'll forecast at the end of the year, and my forecast will become whatever actually transpired. And in that way, my forecast always proves to be correct. It's really quite ingenious. So I've been saying for almost a year now, this will be a year of growth, 2022. 2023 will be very different. Recession comes to America in 2023, and it will not be a particularly shallow one. It may not be the longest recession, but it will not be a particularly shallow one. You'll see a lot of dislocation over a very short amount of time, I suspect beginning with the second quarter of next year. The economy will lose momentum after the holiday shopping season as the consumer pulls back for seasonal reasons, and then things are going to get worse throughout much of the balance of next year. And what is my primary consideration, by the way? It's the Federal Reserve. It's these folks trying to engineer the soft landing. They got us into this situation in the first place. They overstimulated the economy, too much money supply in the economy. And now they're having to take that back too quickly They're going to drive us into recession. And interest rates are rising too quickly to avoid that. Prior to this cycle, we've had 8 previous rate tightening cycles since the early 1980s. 6 have ended in recession. 6. Even Cleveland Browns have a better record than that. The economy will remain unbalanced on top of that, with supply struggling to keep up with demand. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that supply is improving, but we still have lots of inflation. What is inflation? Too much demand chasing too little supply. And then we've got Russia and Ukraine, and of course, Chinese economic lockdowns, and Europe facing energy crises. None of this helps the supply side of the economy. So along with rising wages, that unbalanced economy translates into higher than average economic inflation in both 2022, obviously this year, but also next year. The Federal Reserve is going to have a devil of a time dealing with inflation also in 2023. And they're going to be asked the question, do we keep raising interest rates? Do we wait? What do we do? It's going to be very, very curious to see how they handle this. And the markets will be watching all along, which is why I expect a lot of financial market volatility next year. We've, of course, had a lot of that this year. And then, yes, I'm an economist, so I'm forecasting interest rates to increase. You ask economists anywhere, dry cleaner, movie theater, ballpark, arena, are interest rates going to rise? We will say yes. And we've been doing that for 40 years. Now, mind you, for much of the past 40 years, we've been incorrect. Interest rates have generally fallen for the past 40 years. It doesn't stop us from saying such things because no one holds us accountable, which is why I'm an economist. Nonetheless, this year I feel quite comfortable saying such things because the Federal Reserve has been very hawkish in its language. They're dealing with a lot of inflation, more interest rate increases to come. That much is obvious. And so if you like this kind of data, I have a newsletter at basu.substack.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily dollar for dollars. If you're not interested, please, please, please feel free to pound sand. But with that, let's open up for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Anirban, thank you. I'm here. Anirban, thank you very much for all of that great information. We are running up close to the hour, but we do have quite a few questions here, and I don't think we'll be able to get to a lot of them here with only a couple of minutes left. But I think you hit on the answer to many of them. I think you talked about the reaction we had. Did the Fed put too much money into the system, and now are we turning around and overreacting in the other way? So I'm kind of combining a couple of questions here, but there's one that basically says, rather than this aggressive policy from the Fed, what would happen if we just let things play out without the interference?
Right, that's a great question, and I wish I left more time. But here's the point: I think you'd get just so much inflation if they didn't slow the economy down. And the reason for that is it's now ingrained, Tom, into people's expectations, right? So if I'm a wage earner and I see 8% inflation, I'm going to need something akin to that to keep me whole. You see, recently the Social Security increased their payments, monthly payments, by 8.7% to adjust to inflation. So now these Social Security recipients will have more money to spend, which is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that, but it is inflationary, right? Because you keep indexing things to inflation, it becomes, past inflation translates into future inflation. So that's why they're doing what they're doing. They got us into this mess. They didn't need to. They should have seen through this. They kept stimulating the housing market through 2021, even though housing prices were taking off. They kept buying collateral mortgage-backed securities to keep mortgage rates as low as possible. I mean, really ridiculous stuff, I have to say. And they could see also that the federal government was also investing, or I should say pouring, billions of dollars or trillions of dollars into the economy, which is also inflationary. But the Federal Reserve didn't stop soon enough, and now they're having to overdo it on the other side. So it's just like if you're driving 80 miles an hour up to a stop sign and now you have to brake before you get there, guess what? You're going to brake too hard. Something bad's going to happen. That's where we are.
Yeah, I think you got your message through loud and clear. Just reading these comments, I think they're right on target. That unfortunately they did what they did and put too much money into the system, and now we can't just ignore it, and we have to respond to it. So we are almost up against the hour here. So Anirban, again, thank you very much for your time here today. We will try to get back to folks with the answers to their questions. Just a couple of things in conclusion. Again, please fill out that survey for us. We're very interested in your feedback, and that helps us with planning future sessions here as well. And I do want to remind you that we are going to kind of branch off here with our upcoming town halls. We are going to break into those specifically for the architecture, engineering, contractor segment, as well as a session specifically for our manufacturing friends as well. More to come on that. Look for them to occur in early December. But we will have something out in your inboxes very soon announcing the topics for all of those. So with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next session. Thank you.